Is Pastor John MacArthur a heretic who undermines the value of the Messiah's work on the cross? Some might have you think that he is. Wait, John MacArthur? Seriously? Why? Well, because MacArthur believes that sin sacrifices will be required in the future millennial temple following the Messiah's return. In his commentary on Ezekiel 43, he writes, quote, "Exact offerings in language just as definitive as the literal descriptions in Moses' day are also just as literal here. As the sin offering is a part of future millennial worship, so there are other offerings also." Now, say what you want about John MacArthur. I certainly have my disagreements with him on various issues, but there's really nothing controversial about what he says here. MacArthur is a standard evangelical theologian. In fact, if you looked up standard evangelical theologian in the dictionary, you'd probably see a picture of John MacArthur. Why do I bring up MacArthur's comments about sin sacrifices being performed in the future temple? Well, because Messianic Jews and other Pronomian, that is pro-law Christians, largely agree with MacArthur on this point. Like him, we believe that sin sacrifices will be required in the future. Again, this shouldn't be controversial. However, one modern teacher claims that it is controversial and has tried to challenge the authority of the law of Moses using this issue. In this video, we will respond to this teacher's claims. To give some context, Messianic Jews and other Pronomian Christians believe that the law of Moses is still in effect. We take seriously Jesus' words in Matthew 5:17-20, where he states that he did not come to abolish the law of Moses, affirmed that it will remain in effect as long as heaven and earth exist, and urged his followers to obey its commandments. This straightforward reading of Matthew 5:17-20 is widely agreed upon by New Testament scholars. For more on this passage, see my short book, How Jesus Fulfilled the Law, as well as these videos. However, not everyone agrees with this perspective. One prominent critic of this theology is R.L. Solberg, who has devoted his entire ministry to persuading believers that they are not required to obey God's law given through Moses. Recently, Solberg published a video in which he claims to have devised a single yes or no question that, quote, topples what he calls Torahism, by which he means the biblical doctrine that the law of Moses remains in effect. Here is his question.
Does God still require animal sacrifices to atone for sin? If your answer is no, that's no longer how we atone for sin, which, by the way, is the correct biblical answer, guess what? You're acknowledging that the Old Covenant law is no longer in effect, because the Torah explicitly requires animal sacrifices to atone for sin. And if your answer is yes, they are still required, well, then you've put yourself in quite a pickle. Because first of all, if that's the case, why did Jesus die on the cross? Was his sacrifice not enough to atone for all sin? And secondly, that answer directly contradicts the New Testament, which teaches that Jesus was our ultimate sacrifice of atonement, who appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself, and therefore, sacrifice for sin is no longer necessary.
So, that's Solberg's question. But does it really topple the idea that the law of Moses remains in effect? Should Messianic Jews and Pronomian Christians stop depriving ourselves of crispy pork bacon in the morning? Should we all start working on the Sabbath? Actually, no. The flaw in Solberg's question, as I will explain, is that it is built upon a false assumption, an assumption rooted in supersessionist interpretations regarding the purpose of the sacrificial system. By the way, for a scholarly treatment of this topic from a post-supersessionist approach, I recommend these resources from Jesper Svartvik, these ones from David Moffat, this one from Matthew Thiessen, and this one from Michael Barber. Also, this book from D. Thomas Lancaster is a great resource that is a little more accessible for the general reader. So what is the false assumption built into Solberg's question? Well, his question assumes that animal sin sacrifices at one time atoned for sin in the same way as the Messiah's sacrifice. From this perspective, the sacrificial system was merely a temporary solution to cover sins for those who lived before the arrival of the Messiah. Now that the Messiah has atoned for sin through the sacrifice of himself, if you claim that the law of Moses, which includes sin sacrifices, is still in effect, you are essentially saying that Jesus' sacrifice was not enough to atone for sin. And by the way, in his more recent video on this topic, he confirms that this is indeed his argument. Now, Solberg's solution to the problem created by his supersessionist approach to Scripture is simply to claim that the law of Moses is no longer in effect. According to Solberg, Jesus rendered the sacrificial system unnecessary through his work on the cross. Hence, there's no conflict. So before I provide my answer to Solberg's question, I want to spend some time explaining why Solberg's solution is wildly out of step with biblical teaching. Problems with the supersessionist interpretation of sacrifices. In his short book, What About the Sacrifices?, Messianic Jewish teacher D. Thomas Lancaster highlights 3 difficulties with the supersessionist interpretation adopted by Solberg. As Lancaster points out, the idea that the Messiah's death and resurrection canceled the sacrificial system, 1, contradicts the Messiah's own teaching, 2, contradicts the practices of the apostles, and 3, contradicts the prophets' predictions of the return of the temple and sacrifices in the future Messianic era. Regarding the first difficulty, the Messiah explicitly forbade us from thinking that he came to invalidate the law of Moses. So to claim, as Solberg does, that the Messiah canceled the sacrificial system violates Jesus' commandment against thinking that he came to do that. Jesus said that nothing will pass from the law until the end of the age, and urged his followers to do and teach the commandments of the law. Such a teaching is the opposite of what we would expect if Jesus indeed canceled the sacrificial system. Again, for more on this passage, see my short book, How Jesus Fulfilled the Law, as well as these videos. Speaking of Jesus' followers doing and teaching the commandments, that leads to the second difficulty with Solberg's interpretation. Throughout the New Testament, the apostles continued to endorse the sacrificial system, including sin sacrifices. For instance, at the end of his gospel, immediately following Jesus' ascension, Luke describes the disciples as, quote, continually in the temple blessing God. Luke further presents the apostles as actively participating in the temple services long after Jesus completed his work on the cross. In Acts 21, Paul goes to the extent of joining others in a Nazirite vow and participating in public worship at the temple to reassure the Jewish believers in Jerusalem that he did not teach against the law. Luke records that an offering was made for Paul and the others which would have involved animal sacrifices, including a sin sacrifice. Hence, the notion that offering sin sacrifices is somehow at odds with New Testament theology just doesn't make sense in light of these New Testament passages. As the scholar Jesper Svartvik writes, quote, Jewish Christ believers continued to worship in the temple up to the very end of the book of Acts. This participation in the cult existed alongside their teaching of and describing Jesus' death as a sacrifice, so the two do not seem to have been understood as mutually exclusive. As Dr. Svartvik later goes on to point out, the supersessionist notion that the sacrificial system was merely a temporary solution to sin until the arrival of the Messiah did not actually develop until much later. The earliest mention of this idea appears not in Scripture, but in the 2nd century writings of Justin Martyr. However, the fact that the earliest Christians participated in the sacrificial system does raise the question, why did they stop? Well, as Dr. Svartvik and other scholars argue, it wasn't for theological reasons. Rather, it was for the same reason Jews stopped. Quite simply, the temple had been destroyed. As Daniel Alucci writes, quote, early Christians stopped sacrificing for the completely mundane reason that there was no place to do so. It appears that the supersessionist theologies of later Christian thinkers like Justin Martyr are not rooted in the teachings and practices of Jesus and the apostles. Instead, they arose as a theological rationalization for the historical reality that the temple no longer was in operation. As Svartvik writes, quote, we have good reason to believe that Christians did not stop sacrificing voluntarily. Quite simply, the Christian movement was forced to become a non-sacrificing religion for historical reasons. This leads to the third difficulty that Lancaster mentions. According to the Hebrew prophets, the sacrificial system will be reinstituted in the future Messianic era. Ezekiel explicitly mentions that sin offerings will be offered again. As Lancaster writes, quote, Quote, Ezekiel dedicates 8 chapters to a vivid description of the future temple and its services, a future temple in which the sacrifices are offered, in which the priesthood, the sons of Aaron the priests, serve along with the Levites, and they offer sin offerings, peace offerings, burnt offerings, and festival sacrifices, animal sacrifices. This is the prophetic expectation. When Messiah comes, animal sacrifices will be offered again. By the way, Messianic Jews are not the only ones who point this out. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, evangelical theologians like John MacArthur also acknowledge this fact. But again, this biblical fact simply does not fit with Solberg's supersessionist theology. The prophet's endorsement of a future sacrificial system in the Messianic era, including the offering of sin sacrifices, is the opposite of what we would expect if Jesus canceled the sacrificial system. Does God still require sin sacrifices to atone for sin? In light of the facts we just covered, we are right to reject Solberg's proposed solution to this dilemma in favor of a more biblical position. That is, the law of Moses does indeed remain in effect. But then how do we answer the question? Well, despite Solberg's framing, this issue calls for a little bit of nuance. As we've seen, the Messiah, apostles, and prophets all taught that the sacrificial system, including sin sacrifices, has not been canceled. But similar to when the Jewish people were in exile in Babylon, there is no temple in Jerusalem, and hence no way to give a sin offering like Paul did in Acts 21. So, since the New Testament authors teach that the Torah remains in effect, and also considering our present circumstances of not having access to the Jerusalem temple, does God still require animal sacrifices to atone for sin? No and yes. The answer is no, because sin offerings are meant for temporal atonement in an earthly sanctuary, and currently, God does not dwell in such an earthly sanctuary. Therefore, God's people do not require temporal atonement at this time. However, when the sacrificial system is reinstituted in the future Messianic kingdom, as the prophets predict, then temporal atonement will once again be required for those who draw near to God in the earthly sanctuary. So, in that sense, yes, sin sacrifices are still required to atone for sin. They have not passed from the law, as Jesus made abundantly clear in Matthew 5:17-20. Now, Solberg will argue that this answer puts Christians in a pickle. If sin sacrifices were required when the temple stood, as demonstrated by Paul in Acts 21, and will be required again in the future, as demonstrated in Ezekiel 43, then why did Jesus die on the cross? Doesn't this suggest that Jesus' sacrifice was not enough to atone for sin? I don't think Paul or Ezekiel thought that when they endorsed sin sacrifices. So how do we address this apparent dilemma? How do we reconcile Paul and Ezekiel with the author of Hebrews, who said that Jesus' sacrifice does away with sin? The way to overcome this apparent dilemma is to understand what sin sacrifices in the Torah actually accomplished. As I said at the beginning of this video, Solberg's question is built upon a false assumption, an assumption rooted in supersessionist theology. That assumption is that animal sacrifices accomplished the same thing as the Messiah's sacrifice. Solberg thinks that sin sacrifices were merely a temporary solution to cover sins until the Messiah came and atoned for sins completely. However, that is not the case. As the author of Hebrews makes abundantly clear, the blood of bulls and goats could never take away sin. Animal sacrifices were never intended to provide the type of atonement that only the Messiah's sacrifice could accomplish. They were never intended to accomplish atonement with regard to our eternal standing before God. People have only ever been saved on the basis of the Messiah's sacrifice, not animal sacrifices. That is why, in my answer that I gave earlier, I clarified that animal sacrifices provide only temporal atonement. They cleansed the earthly sanctuary from human sin and impurity, making it possible to draw near to God in the earthly sanctuary without physically dying. As Lancaster writes, quote, "Though the worshiper was able to draw near to God within the temple on earth through means of the sacrificial blood of animals, such blood never availed to bring him near to God in the eternal sense of life after death and the world to come. Though the blood of the bull allowed him to draw near to God's presence in the earthly tabernacle, it did not avail him the same privilege in the true temple in heaven. The Master brings us near to God in the heavenly temple. So the animal sacrifices performed by earthly priests were to prevent earthly death while in God's presence on earth. In that sense, they did provide a type of earthly salvation, if you will. They allowed a person to approach God in the earthly sanctuary without dying. But again, animal sacrifices did not affect a person's eternal standing before God. That was not their function. Eternal salvation is something only the Messiah's sacrifice could accomplish. The Messiah's sacrifice accomplished eternal atonement, cleansing the heavenly tabernacle from human sin. Both types of sacrifices enable people to draw near to God. Animal sacrifices for when God dwells on earth in a physical sanctuary, hence the need for sin sacrifices during the millennium, and the Messiah sacrifice so that we can boldly draw near to the throne of grace and receive mercy, having our sins taken away and our consciences cleansed. To put it another way, the Messiah's sacrifice doesn't cleanse the earthly sanctuary, it cleanses the heavenly sanctuary. Similarly, animal sacrifices don't cleanse the heavenly sanctuary, they cleanse the earthly sanctuary. Animal sacrifices restored a person or an object, since sacred objects are also atoned for in the scriptures, to a state of ritual purity and acceptance within the community or sacred space on earth. When the sacrificial system is restored in the future, as the prophets declare, sin sacrifices will once again be required to fulfill such purposes. In addition to providing temporal atonement so that a worshiper can draw near to God in the physical sanctuary, sin sacrifices serve as prophetic symbols that point to the Messiah's work. Before the Messiah, they pointed forward to his work, and in the future Messianic age, they will point back to his work. John MacArthur actually puts this point quite well. Quote, as Old Testament sacrifices pointed forward to Christ's death, so these, that is, sin sacrifices performed during the millennium, are tangible expressions not competing with, but pointing back to the value of Christ's completely effective sacrifice once for all. Now, Solberg wants to argue that people like John MacArthur are undermining the value of the Messiah's work when they say that sin sacrifices will be reinstituted in the future, but that argument works only if one assumes that animal sacrifices provided atonement that affected our eternal standing before God. However, as we've learned, animal sacrifices were not intended for that purpose. Consequently, when the Apostle Paul in Acts 21, or a worshiper in the future millennium, participates in offering a sin sacrifice so they could draw near to God in the physical sanctuary, it does not undermine the Messiah's sacrifice. Such offerings had, and will have, a valid role in relation to the earthly tabernacle, while also serving as symbolic shadows that point to the Messiah's work. Ironically, the real way to undermine the Messiah's sacrifice would be to claim, as Solberg does, that animal sacrifices at one time did provide the type of atonement that the Messiah's sacrifice provides. Suggesting that the sacrificial system covered sin until the Messiah came raises the question, well, why would the Messiah need to endure a horrific death if God could have simply accepted animal sacrifices? Those who hold to supersessionist theology really have no satisfying answer to that question. Before we wrap up, Solberg makes a second objection to those of us who believe that the law of Moses remains in effect. He argues that our understanding of sin sacrifices contradicts the book of Hebrews, which apparently teaches that the Torah's sin sacrifices are now canceled in light of the Messiah's work. Now, this video is already too long, so I'm not going to spend time refuting this objection. I'll just note that Solberg's reading of Hebrews is, once again, colored by his theological assumptions rooted in supersessionist theology. However, New Testament scholars are increasingly rejecting this reading. For example, Dr. Matthew Thiessen writes, quote, there simply is no evidence in Hebrews that the author rejects the ritual and cultic aspects of the Jewish law. Rather, there is strong evidence that he thinks these aspects of the law remain in effect at the time of his writing. I cover some of this evidence in the appendix of my short book, How Jesus Fulfilled the Law. I also recommend these papers from Matthew Thiessen, David Moffat, and Jesper Svartvik. Also, once again, this book from D. Thomas Lancaster is a wonderful introduction to these ideas for a general audience. So, what's the verdict? Did R.L. Solberg successfully topple the theology of Messianic Jews and Pronomian Christians regarding the law's validity? Personally, I'm not impressed. This argument fails to deliver what it promises. I hope that you found this video helpful. Definitely check out the scholarly resources I mentioned if you want to learn more about this topic, and I'll catch you on the flip side. Hey everyone, thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to see more content like this, I want to invite you to subscribe to my channel. Also, don't forget to hit that little bell so that you'll be notified when new videos like this are released. One last thing. Be sure to connect with me on my website, davidwilber.com. There, you can find a ton of free resources like articles and videos, learn more about the books that I've written, and subscribe to my newsletter to ensure you never miss an update. Again, thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.